I don't know why, but America seems cursed to have ghosts all over the place. Maybe it has something to do with the fact it's built on a few hundred ancient burial grounds, but hey, that's not my issue. If you were to roll your wagon down to San Antonio, Texas and take a trip to Shane Road, you'll find a set of railroad tracks that have become quite the local legend. Many years ago, around the 1940s, a school bus full of kids were on their way home from school and was passing over a level crossing when the bus broke down. As the driver struggled to start the bus, a train came barreling down the line. The driver tried to get as many kids off the bus as they could, but it was too late as the train slammed into it, killing roughly 10 children and the driver. Another account of the story says that it was a nun driving the bus late in the evening. Most of the kids were asleep and the nun was trying to quietly restart the bus when the train appeared out of nowhere. The locomotive's headlamp had broken, so it wasn't visible until it was bearing down on the bus. The nun tried to wake the kids in time but failed, resulting in 10 children dying. Miraculously, she was thrown out of the front window of the bus on impact and survived the event. Distraught at the thought of causing the deaths of several children, the nun became guilt-ridden and drove to the crossing a few days later, stopping her car in the middle of the tracks, waiting for the next train. Later, when a train did appear, she heard faint familiar voices. Then, her car was slowly pushed forwards off the crossing just before the train would have struck it. She quickly got out of the car and looked around for the person that had saved her life, only to find nobody around and several child-sized handprints on the back of her car. Blessed with newfound purpose, the nun opened an orphanage to look after lost children in the same way the lost children looked after her. To this day, the ghosts are supposedly still there, as if you were to stop your car on the crossing, it is said that the spirits will push your car to safety. Many have tried it and found their cars did move. Others have sprinkled baby powder on their car as they've stopped and reported seeing handprints be left behind after their car was moved. The ghosts have appeared in other ways too. Some say that if you stand by the crossing late at night, you can hear the sound of a steam locomotive approaching. It sounds its whistle and you can hear its brakes scream as if it's trying to stop, but no train is ever seen. Another story involved a local woman driving past the crossing one night and spotting a little girl standing beside the line, all alone. The woman stopped and offered the girl a ride home. She got in the car and when they arrived at the girl's house, she seemed hesitant to get out. The woman assumed the girl had fallen out with her parents and ran away from home, so she stepped out of the car saying she'd talk with her parents. As she stepped out of the car, she looked back to give the girl a reassuring smile, only for the girl to have vanished. She opened the car door to find nobody there, with no sign of her around. The seatbelt, however, was still fastened. Another account of the ghosts came a few years ago, when a girl and several of her friends travelled to the site. After taking a few pictures, she emailed them to her mother, only for her to be shocked when she spotted a ghost in one of her daughter's pictures. It is possible, however, that the whole thing has been made up, as despite people hearing children's voices at the scene as well as seeing their handprints, I found conflicting reports that such an accident ever took place in San Antonio. A bus was hit by a train in 1938 during a blizzard, but that was in Salt Lake City in Utah. It's quite possible that some wires were crossed at some point and the stories got mixed up, but all the same, the ghosts are still present in San Antonio, so maybe something did happen at that crossing. I just suppose we'll never know what it was that caused those children to stick around. Ghosts take on many forms, be they animals, people, or ominous figures that stand at the end of your garden, watching you while your back is turned and what was that thing you just saw out the corner of your eye? But surprisingly, one frequently sighted ghost takes on a rather different form, the form of a former US president. Of all the presidents that have died, Abraham Lincoln seems to be the one that doesn't want to shuffle off of his mortal coil anytime soon, as there have been many accounts of his ghost being spotted all around the White House and other areas he frequently worked in, with President Truman hearing raps at the door while sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom, Eleanor Roosevelt and the family dog sensing Lincoln's presence throughout the White House, and even sightings of his ghost at his grave in Springfield, Illinois. It's fair to say he doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. And it's not just Americans that have met the spirit. During a visit to the White House, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was taking a long late-night bath with a drink of scotch and a cigar to help him relax. The account says he got out of the bath and entered the adjoining bedroom still naked apart from the cigar, and was startled to see Lincoln standing by the fireplace leaning on the mantel. Churchill supposedly took the cigar out of his mouth, tapped off the ash at the end, and said, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage." The ghost chuckled at the remark and disappeared, leaving Churchill naked and a little bamboozled. But Lincoln also seems to have a way of getting his ghostly self around the place when he's looking for a place to spook. In 1865, the US Railroad started work on building a luxury steam locomotive to tow the president around. While Lincoln wasn't a fan of the idea, he still let it be built. He never got to see the finished locomotive, however, on account of him suffering from a terminal case of being shot through the head. It was completed shortly after his death and named the Lincoln Memorial, where it was used to pull Lincoln's funeral train around the country to 12 funerals all held for the president. The locomotive was never used again after this. Every year in April, around the anniversary of his death, it is said that a ghost train passes through several stations pulling the funeral train. Eyewitnesses say they can hear an odd-sounding steam engine whistle followed by a steam locomotive approaching them, pulling several carriages draped in black with a strange blue glow surrounding the whole train. It sounds its whistle again as it stops at the station. Some accounts say there are skeletons of soldiers on board playing music, though no sound is heard. Others say they've seen the soldiers guard a coffin loaded in one of the carriages. After 20 minutes, the engine whistles again and begins to leave the station, eventually disappearing down the line. Locals living in areas where the train stops have reported their clocks stopping for 20 minutes on nights where the train is spotted. So who knows? Maybe old Abe is still around and kicking, just not in a physical form. Or it could just be a whole bunch of coincidences. Whatever the case, it'd sure be one hell of a sight to see that pull into the station on your way home from work. Stockholm, Sweden, home to many things, including the world's narrowest street, a bunch of museums, and the world's largest hemispherical building. It's also home to a very infamous ghost train, or more accurately, ghost subway. In 1965, the Stockholm Metro purchased 8 unpainted second-hand subway carriages to add to their fleet of locomotives. They were left with just bare aluminium while they were being tested instead of being painted green like the rest of the fleet. If they were cheap to run, build and maintain, then they would help expand the Metro transit system. At the time, all the carriages on the Metro were painted green, so the sudden appearance of unpainted silver carriages came as a surprise to the regular commuters. The trains were nicknamed Silverpillen, or the Silver Arrow in English, by the locals, but weren't well liked by passengers because of their bare look. On top of that, because they were being tested, no posters or advertisements were put up, giving them an eerie atmosphere while riding inside them. It also didn't help that they were second-hand, so while they were kept clean, they were still clearly worn out and dirty in some places. The dystopian appearance of the carriages compared to the more uniform green carriages used by the Metro led them to become the centre of some urban myths. Some began to say that if you got on board the Silver Arrow, you wouldn't be taken to any station. Instead, you'd just travel and never get out. Other stories said that once a year, after midnight, the train appears, filled with passengers of the living dead, all bearing expressionless vacant looks. If you wanted to get to the next station and boarded Silverpillen, it would be 1 week before you arrived. In 1975, the Metro expanded and built a station at Shumlinga to service an area that was expected to develop. The area was never developed, and as such the station was never fully completed, and subsequently never opened for passenger use. Because it was never used by passengers, it was left bare, giving it a very empty and haunting appearance. Rumours soon spread that the station was only used by spirits, and that only the dead get off at Shumlinga. It wasn't long before the station and Silverpillen's story became intertwined, and it soon became the home of the ghost train. The stories were obviously never real, but they stuck to the trains and the station regardless. The Silver Arrow carriages were eventually decommissioned in 1996, and all but 2 were scrapped. One was put into a local railway museum, while the other is located at the factory that built it. Despite the carriages being gone, the story still remains, showing that just because something is gone doesn't mean it's forgotten. In recent years, older buildings have been repurposed as times and industries change. Many grand railway stations have converted old halls and hotel rooms into office spaces or storage for maintenance equipment. There's a railway station in Vancouver, however, that along with these changes also seems to have converted itself into a haunted house. Waterfront Station was built by the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1915 and served as a terminus for passenger trains travelling from Toronto and Montreal. The station was built in a time when travelling by train had a sense of elegance and class, and as such, the station was built with restaurants and a dance hall occupying the west wing of the building and places of residence and lodging for travellers in the east wing. In 1928, a brakeman named Hub Clark was working in the yard when he slipped on a wet rail and was knocked unconscious, laying across the tracks. A passenger train came down the line a few minutes later and killed him, supposedly decapitating him. Ever since, a headless man wandering around the area holding a lantern has supposedly been spotted on rainy nights. The thing is, Clark doesn't seem to be the only ghost lingering around the station. As times have changed, the restaurant is now located in the east wing, with the upper floors either being used for office spaces or storage. Security guards usually patrol around the area at night, and many have claimed to have encountered some rather unusual things. One guard reported they heard the sound of 1920s music playing in a corridor. When they investigated, they found a woman dancing alone in a 1920s style flapper dress. As the guard approached her, the music suddenly stopped and the woman vanished. Another guard said while they were patrolling the northwest corridor of the building, they entered an empty room with only a flashlight to look around, only to encounter the ghost of an old woman. The woman supposedly glowed phosphorus white and had a mournful look on her face. The woman reached out toward the guard, to which the guard turned and ran. On the upper floor of the east side, a guard said they entered a room that was used to store a number of old desks. As they looked around, a desk was quietly moved in front of the door. When the guard turned and saw the desk blocking the doorway, they quickly jumped over it and ran out of the room. There have also been several reports of hearing phantom footsteps around the station, and many said to have seen the ghosts of 3 little old ladies sat on a station bench as if waiting for a train. The most ominous story came when a security guard was checking an old kitchen, only to find an old woman standing there, staring intently at him. She began to float towards the guard, who immediately turned and ran. For days afterward, he kept seeing the face of the old woman appear in his dreams and seeing her reflection in windows and mirrors. He eventually was overcome with the urge to paint the woman despite having little prior art experience. Once done, he left the painting in the kitchen and he didn't see the old woman again. After a while, management had someone move the painting out of the kitchen. The person that moved the painting said they began having dreams of the old woman and that they didn't stop until they put the painting back. The ghost of Hub Clark is well within its rights to haunt the station, but it seems it's not alone. Whoever this old lady is that's haunting the station too seems to have it in for someone. Hopefully someone will eventually find a way to calm the spirit down, as I'm sure many of the security guards would be thankful for it. Lake Superior is a beautiful place, but don't let that fool you. The lake may look tame, but many ships have sank or been lost to its unforgiving tides. Because of this, the lake is home to many a tale of ghost ships and lost souls. What you might not expect though, among all the ghost ships and lost sailors, are the spirits of a few railroad men also haunting the waters. In June of 1910, a freight train was rolling along the line of the Canadian Pacific Railway, following the shores of Lake Superior. The driver was a man named Frank Wheatley. Accompanying him was fireman E. Clark and brakeman J. McMillan. It was late at night and they were getting close to Mink Harbour. By morning, however, the train hadn't arrived at its destination. No breakdown was reported and the train was never seen arriving at Mink Harbour. The train hadn't simply vanished though. After investigating the line, it was found that a rock slide had occurred. The line followed a cliff face, with a wall of rock on one side of the track and a 65-foot drop into the lake below on the other. The train had rounded a blind corner and ran right into the rock slide, with the engine and several wagons running off the rails into the lake below. The brakeman was found dead beside the tracks. Evidence suggested he panicked and tried to jump to safety, but died after leaping from the train. The driver and fireman went down into the lake along with the engine, with only the driver's body ever found. The location of the wreck was charted, but nobody was able to dive down to it or recover the engine as the diving equipment required for such a job simply wasn't available. For many years after, people said they've spotted 3 silhouettes standing beside the line where the train derailed, seeming to appear and disappear at will. While nobody has managed to get a good enough look at them to confirm if they are the spirits of the enginemen, given how the accident happened in that location, it's more than likely the 3 men are still there, looking for their lost train. In 2014, the wreck was eventually explored by divers who photographed the rusted remains. Plans to haul the engine out of the lake were made, but quickly scrapped when it was made clear the metal was far too rusted and frail to be moved without breaking apart. The divers also tried searching for the body of the fireman, but it was never found. The railway ghosts of Lake Superior are by far the least well known, as they are overshadowed by many of the other stories of ghost ships and spooky sailors sailing around the lake. But it's still nice to see a little diversity in the ghost population from time to time, eh? You wouldn't expect anything of note to happen on a quiet branch line in Ireland, but if there's one thing ghosts love, it's appearing in places you wouldn't expect. 'Twas the summer of 1924 in Ireland. Along a quiet branch line between Clones and Armagh, there was a small station platform. 2 men were sat at the empty station waiting for the next train. As they waited, they started to hear several hushed voices coming from the station building behind them. Among the voices was a series of moans and groans. One of them was curious and peeked through the station window, but only saw an empty room with several benches and a long table inside. He returned to his colleague and sat down, likely brushing off the noises as nothing. Very soon they heard the sound of an engine's whistle and stood up, moving to the edge of the platform in anticipation of its arrival. The sound of the approaching train became louder and louder, but no train was seen. The sound then passed them and continued down the line as if the train was invisible. As it passed, they heard a loud scream followed by an almost deafening engine whistle. The signalman came down to the station 2 minutes later, and the men questioned him on whether or not he heard or saw anything. The signalman said he heard nothing. After further conversation, the signalman informed the 2 men that a man had jumped in front of a train from the same platform a year prior, uncertain if it was an accident or an attempt of suicide. He was seriously injured but alive, so he was brought into the station's waiting room in an attempt to save him. Unfortunately, his injuries were severe and he passed away soon after. The signalman pointed out the table the man had spotted in the waiting room and said, "He died right there on that table." The line has been closed in recent years, and all that remains is the grown-over track bed and a few stations. Many people have contested the story or brushed it off as a myth, but a man still died, and for all we know, his ghost might still be there, along with the train that took his life. If you travel on any metro system in the world, you're bound to see some weird people. I don't know what it is about subways, but for whatever reason, they just seem to cause weird people to spawn out of thin air. If you were to travel on the London Underground though, you might find that 1 or 2 of these weird people literally do appear out of thin air. Born in 1847, William Therese was a very famous and beloved English actor who became well known for playing famous heroic roles such as Robin Hood and starred in many reenactments of Shakespeare's plays. He was known to be an interesting character, with a handsome face, fine voice and a very friendly demeanour. This charisma allowed him to star in many theatrical performances, with comedy being one of his strong suits. Around the late 1890s, Therese helped a young actor by the name of Richard Prince find work in plays and performances he was starring in. Over the years, however, Prince had started to abuse alcohol, and by 1897 it had become a massive problem. By the December of 1897, Prince was unable to find work, and so Therese gave Prince some money to help keep him going until he got a break. On the 13th of December, they had a falling out, and 3 days later, on the 16th, Prince was denied money from the funds office. Later that night, as Therese was entering the Adelphi Theatre, Prince jumped him and stabbed him to death. Therese's last words were supposedly, "I will come back." When Prince was caught, he was arrested and thrown into the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. The London Underground is a rather scary place to be at night. Maybe it's the empty atmosphere, maybe it's the unnerving sound of trains and squeaking and echoing down the tunnels. Or maybe it's just because it's London and you're likely going to get stabbed yourself. In any case, the Underground is a spooky place, which was only made spookier when people started to spot a ghost wandering around Covent Garden station. Many drivers have spoken of seeing a shadowy figure in one of the tunnels after the station has been cleared for the night, alongside echoing footsteps, a disembodied voice, and many unexplained banging noises. A ticket collector at the station said he had many encounters with the spectre. One night, while checking over the empty platform, the ticket collector spotted a tall, distinguished man walking along the rails in a westbound direction, before climbing the emergency spiral stairs. The ticket collector phoned the clerk upstairs and informed them of the approaching man. The ticket collector took the lift up to the clerk, only to be met by the confused clerk when he arrived, who informed him that nobody had come up the stairs. A few days later, the same ticket collector was having his midnight dinner in the staff room when he heard the door open. Assuming it was just another member of staff on break, he continued his meal until he turned and saw he was face to face with the same tall, distinguished man as before. He was wearing a grey suit with a high collar shirt and white gloves. The ticket collector asked what the man wanted, thinking he was a passenger that had gotten lost, only for the man to say nothing, simply staring at the collector before fading away. 4 days later, while in the staff room, several station employees were disturbed by a loud scream, followed by a young porter rushing into the room, wide-eyed and frightened. He claimed to have seen a strange-looking man stood in the corner of the neighbouring room, but as he approached the man, he felt a disturbing sensation and an oppressive weight bear down onto him, before the man simply faded away. Another station foreman encountered the ghost, feeling the same sense of dread. This time he heard a disembodied voice murmuring a name that sounded something close to Terry. After being shown a picture of the dead actor, the foreman confirmed that the ghost he had seen was that of William Therese. The ghost of Therese has been spotted all over London, from strolling down the street to haunting the very theatre he died in. It's unknown why exactly Therese has decided to spook the London Underground of all places, but the current theory is that Covent Garden station was built in the same place as a bakery that Therese frequently visited. He was known to spend several hours there whenever he visited, so who knows? I suppose it's fitting that he's still just as much of an interesting character in death as he was in life. It seems fairly obvious that you shouldn't walk along railway tracks, but sometimes when you're standing on top of a bridge, staring out at a beautiful view, it can be easy to forget about the few hundred tons of freight that's headed towards you. It's a mistake a few people have made, and ultimately, one that has led to a few places becoming haunted. Built in 1911 for the Wisconsin Central Railway, the Soo High Line Bridge spans across the St. Croix River. There was another bridge spanning the river at the time, but was elevated slightly compared to the rest of the line, necessitating an extra engine to help push heavy trains onto the bridge. The new bridge was more level with the rest of the railway, and so removed the need for extra engines to help push the trains. The bridge is very long and very narrow. Because of this, it is almost impossible to be stood on it while a train is passing over it, as it's only just wide enough to fit an engine and the train it's pulling. As you'd expect, this didn't stop local residents from walking across it, as it was one of the quickest ways across the river at the time. Surprisingly, not too many people have died on the bridge, but there are those who have come to an unfortunate end while trying to cross it. The bridge is roughly half a mile long, so there have been times when people were halfway across when a locomotive came barreling down the line. And because there wasn't enough room for them to stand beside the line, they had to make a choice. Either lay down and hope the engine passes over you, or jump off the side and hope the river gives you a soft landing. Option A wasn't much good, as most American locomotives were fitted with cow catchers, which were designed for moving obstructions off the track, so you'd get hit anyway. Option B, jumping off the side, seemed better on paper because there was a river to break your fall. But it's a very wide river, so you would likely drown, provided you survived the 184-foot drop to begin with. Suffice to say, it'd be much safer for you to just find another path to walk down. Because so many people have met an unfortunate end on the bridge, a walkway and railing has been added in recent years to allow for people to cross the bridge without incident. Everyone who has ever died on the bridge has been found and buried, everyone apart from one man. It's unsure when exactly it happened, but the story goes that a young man was walking across the bridge one day when he was faced with a train bearing down on him. He jumped for his life and died in the river, but his body was never found. Supposedly, his girlfriend, distraught, kept searching for his body long after the incident, but she never managed to find it. After her death, many people say they've seen the ghost of a woman in white searching up and down the bridge. Sometimes it's said that she carries a blue lantern, while others have said they've only ever seen the lantern without the ghost. Those that have encountered her and tried to communicate said that she was unresponsive and simply kept moving down the line, eventually fading away into the distance. While not the most active or infamous ghost to haunt a railway structure, she's still well known in the ghost hunting community. Perhaps it's worth taking a trip over there and giving giving her a hand, because it certainly sounds like she needs the help. Australia is home to many things: Vegemite, cheap lager, and a vast array of animals that are bred with the sole purpose of ruining your day. If you were to focus on Macquarie Fields, however, you'd also find there are a few ghosts spooking down under. The Macquarie Fields station was opened in 1888 and has remained open ever since. In 1906, a woman named Emily Jengerson was killed at the station after being run over by a train. The woman had been suffering from sleeplessness and melancholia to the point where she'd been moved to a mental hospital. On the day of the accident, she was boarding a train to visit a friend, accompanied by a nurse. As they got off at a station, Jengerson quickly jumped back onto the train, leaving the nurse behind. After arriving at Macquarie Fields, she stepped off the train and wandered around the station. She was last seen leaving a tool shed before walking into the path of an oncoming train and kneeling on the tracks. Emily was reported as cut to pieces, and the coroner ruled that it was without question a suicide attempt. For years since, a ghost is said to haunt the platform. Strangely though, the ghost appears in the form of a teenage girl. When the station is empty late at night, people say they can hear a faint crying. Others have reported seeing the ghost wandering around the station and even sitting in the middle of the rails. There's been some speculation as to whether the ghost is even that of Emily Jengerson, as other stories say it's the ghost of a regretful suicide victim, or that she fell in front of a train years ago. Others have speculated the ghost is that of a young woman who was murdered after missing the last train home one night. We might not know who the spirit is that's stuck haunting the station, but whoever it is must have a reason for hanging around there. A mystery it shall remain until somebody figures it out, and maybe then people will be a bit less scared on their way home from work. Ghosts appearing in the middle of the woods isn't an uncommon thing. That's why it's always best to travel with a friend whenever you go for a hike. But while travelling through the woods on a hiking trail, miles away from any road or railway, the last thing you'd expect to find is the rusted remains of a steam locomotive, and many spirits lurking around it. It was around the 24th of February, 1910 in Wellington, Washington. A mail train and a passenger train both set off for Seattle and had to pass through the mountainside town of Wellington. The town was built to serve as a stop for the Great Northern Railway, where trains could refuel and passengers could stop on long trips. It had been snowing heavily for several days now, with roughly 1 foot of snow falling every hour. On its worst day, 11 feet of snow fell. The mail and passenger trains arrived through a tunnel at the Wellington station. The line was starting to become blocked with snow, and there was nothing the snowplows or the snow shovelers could do to clear it. The snow lasted for days. Workmen were starting to run out of coal to power their plows, and most of the shovelers eventually gave up, saying it was futile and that they weren't being paid enough to deal with it. Passengers of the train could only wait for the weather to clear up. Many became agitated and others became concerned. They asked the workmen if they could back the trains into the nearby tunnels for safety, but the workmen simply said that everything was safe where it was. Passengers and local residents were worried as several avalanches could be heard in the distance over the few days the trains were stuck in Wellington. Most of these avalanches were what was blocking the line. On the 28th of February, the snow had stopped falling, but in its place came rain and warmer winds. At 1 AM on the 1st of March, a lightning bolt struck the side of the mountain, causing a slab of snow a quarter of a mile wide, half a mile long and 10 foot tall to break free and come crashing down the mountainside. To make things worse, a forest fire had broken out in the previous summer and destroyed a large amount of the trees between the town and the incoming avalanche. The avalanche missed the town's hotel and post office, but decimated the railroad depot, slamming into the trains and forcing them 150 feet down the mountain and into the Ty River in the valley below. 6 locomotives and 15 wagons, including carriages, were swept away along with the crew and passengers that were sleeping inside them. Out of the 119 people caught in the avalanche, only 23 survived. Among the dead were 35 passengers, 58 railroad employees on the train, and 3 employees based at the depot. The 23 that survived were pulled immediately from the wreck, but the weather conditions made it almost impossible to find all the bodies. It wasn't until 21 weeks later, in late July, that the last body was recovered. The avalanche is recorded as one of the most fatal in American history. It's said that to this day, people are still finding the remains of the locomotives and carriages that were swept away. Shortly afterwards, the town renamed itself Ty to get away from the associations that came with the accident, and the railway company installed snow sheds to keep the tracks safe along the route. The railway station station and depot were eventually closed in 1929 after a second tunnel was built further down the mountain. The town no longer served a purpose and ended up abandoned, eventually being burnt down. The old track bed and tunnel have since been preserved and have become part of the Iron Goat Trail. For years after the accident, people have said they've spotted ghostly figures hanging around the area. Disembodied voices can be heard calling out, wailing and moaning. Screams and other ominous sounds can be heard in the tunnel, sourceless. Many hikers and tourists have found cold spots or areas of the trail that are abnormally cold in comparison to the surrounding area. Some reported feeling sudden chills and goosebumps for no apparent reason, while others claim to have seen apparitions all over the area and felt invisible hands touching and grabbing them. It wouldn't be wrong to assume that the spirits of those who have died in the avalanche may not have gotten over the ordeal. While there isn't much recorded evidence to prove there is something hanging around the trail, the fact that numerous people have reported eerie sights and unsettling feelings while being there is no coincidence. So while the Iron Goat Trail does seem like a nice scenic hiking spot, I'd certainly recommend not being there after dark. Today's ghost story isn't a well-known urban legend like many of the others, but from an article I found online written by someone interested in a local myth. They travelled to Newfoundland to interview a few people with first-hand experience sighting a ghost. This is the story they told. Around the late 1980s, a young lad around the age of 16 was walking home along an old railway track around Manuel's, Conception Bay South in Canada. It was an autumn evening and he was walking alone when he noticed what sounded like footsteps following behind him. At first he suspected it was just the stones of the old track bed settling behind him as he walked, but as he continued, he noticed that the sounds seemed to be some distance behind him. He stopped and looked back. There was nobody around, but the stones about 15 feet behind him were being disturbed as if someone was walking towards him. He ran away from the noise, and by the time he had reached the end of the tracks, the sound had stopped. A lady also gave another account of the story, with her experience with the ghost taking place roughly in 2004 or 2005. She was out late one night with friends, and as they passed by the tracks, she said she spotted a whitish-grey blob, almost akin to a patch of fog, hovering in the middle of the tracks. As she focused on it, she could clearly see it was a woman dressed in an old-style white dress with her head hung low, as if saddened or searching for something. The woman walked from the tracks to a pathway besides the line that led to the road simply before disappearing. The witness wasn't scared but was convinced of what she saw. After doing a little digging, it was found the ghost was possibly the phantom of a young bride-to-be named Miss Malloy, who was left standing at the altar. She left the church and started walking down the railway line around Easons Road. When she heard a train coming, she tried to step off the tracks, but her dress got caught on one of the railway ties. Unable to free herself in time, she was struck down by the train. In typical ghost story fashion, it said her spirit now wanders up and down the line, searching for the man that was meant to be her husband. The story of a bride dying after being left at the altar isn't anything new. In fact, it's a very frequent ghost tale. But the fact that several people have encountered something supernatural in the same place, years apart, is enough to make you wonder if poor Miss Malloy may still be lingering around the area. I suppose it's one wedding day nobody's going to forget anytime soon. If you were to take a trip around Darlington, you might want to stop by North Road Station, as it is now home to a small railway museum with various trinkets and collector's items kept in an authentic station master's office, as well as locomotion number 1, one of the first steam locomotives built by George and Robert Stephenson. While the atmosphere around the station is warm and inviting, the station is also home to 2 rather bad-tempered ghosts. The station was opened for passenger service in 1842. In 1845, a ticket clerk at the station by the name of Thomas Winter was suffering from severe depression. He was at a low point one day when he was constantly berated by complaints from an irate passenger. The constant ridicule was enough to push him over the edge, and one night he shot himself in the station toilets. His body was found the next day. A few years later, around the 1850s, a night watchman was walking alone around the station when he spotted a man dressed in uniform leave one of the station buildings. The man was accompanied by what looked like a big black Labrador. The watchman approached the man, believing he was trespassing. The man swiftly turned around and punched the watchman in the face before setting the dog on him. The dog bit viciously at the watchman's legs before being called off by the mysterious trespasser. Both the man and the dog moved away from the watchman and walked into the coal house. The watchman, shaken by what he had just experienced, felt himself over, believing he'd be bleeding from the dog bites. To his surprise, he found no bite marks and that he seemed physically unharmed aside from falling onto the floor. He got up and ran to the coal house, only to find nobody there. After telling some of his colleagues about the incident, he learned that the man he saw matched the description of Thomas Winter, the man who'd shot himself years prior, and that his body was taken to the coal house to be wrapped in a shroud after his death. Ever since, people have said they've spotted a man in uniform and a large black dog walking together around the station at night, and to this day, locals still fear using the station at night, else risk being attacked by the angry ghost and his loyal dog. Another ghost that supposedly haunts the station is that of a young Victorian girl. An old, third-class Victorian railway carriage that was built in 1865 currently resides at the station's museum. Numerous people have spotted a young girl dressed in Victorian clothing seated in the carriage, and staff members at the museum have said they've heard the sounds of a child laughing and singing coming from inside the carriage, as well as an unsolved knocking noise. While nobody is quite sure of the origin of the little girl, I think it's fair to say she's got the right idea hiding in that carriage, because if I was stuck haunting that station with an ill-tempered ghost, I'd probably try and stay out of their way too. So if you do want to look around a nice little museum, then by all means head over to Darlington's North Road station. Just be careful not to annoy any rail staff that happen to have dogs with them. Trains are a fairly reliable mode of transport. I think we can all agree on that. They used to get you almost anywhere you wanted to be in the UK and even spanned the entire continents of America and Europe. So it makes sense that with such reliable transport readily available, that the devil himself would use a train to transport some damned souls to hell. An urban legend tells the tale of a station master who was on duty one night in Newark Central Station, New Jersey. An old cowboy had been hanging around the station for a few days, not doing anything wrong, but seemingly striking a nerve with station staff just for loitering around. One night, the man was at the station in a state of panic, calling out to passers-by that, "It's coming for me, it's coming for me," and whenever someone asked what was after him, he would say, "I've done wrong. I've killed a man that cheated me at cards, and now I'm gonna pay." By this point, the station master had enough and threatened to call the police if he didn't shut up. The old man responded with, "The express train for hell is coming for my soul, you've gotta help me." As the clock read 2 minutes to midnight, a loud whistle was heard coming from down the line. The next train wasn't due until 12:05, which puzzled the station master. The sound of a steam locomotive could be heard rapidly approaching the station, but nothing was seen. The old cowboy was screaming at this point, standing at the edge of the platform and staring at the oncoming noise. The station master pulled the man away from the platform just as there was another whistle and a rush of air as if a train was speeding by. The sound of steel wheels grinding on the rails could be heard and the presence of something big speeding past could be felt, but nothing was there. The old man gave a wail, and as the station master turned to look back at him, he was gone. Another account said that the station master was holding the man and that he simply vanished from his arms. The train seemed to disappear down the line until nobody could hear it. When the station master checked the time, it was exactly midnight. The passengers that had witnessed the event were spooked, but the station master did his best to calm them down and convince them it was just a passing train. After the passengers settled down, it said that the station master went to his office and poured himself a large drink before getting back to work. Odds are good that this urban legend is nothing more than a tall tale, but it is certainly one hell of a way to take someone to the afterlife. I wonder if they ever put that on the timetable after the incident. 12 AM express to hell. Sounds like a nice trip. Ghost trains and lingering spirits are fairly commonplace around railway stations and other railway infrastructure. Stations, bridges, and especially tunnels seem to be home to many supernatural things if you look for them. Usually it's some form of ghost. However, there's one old tunnel that's rumoured to be home to something a little more vicious than a phantom. A vampire. The Churchill Tunnel was built in 1873 for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. During its construction, the tunnel faced many problems in the form of cave-ins. The ground was soft and easily affected by rainfall, causing it to swell after a downpour. Even Even after it was completed, the tunnel posed a constant safety risk to both those in and above it, and as such was eventually abandoned after a much safer alternate route was built for the railroad by 1901. By 1925, the railroad decided to start restoring the tunnel with the intention of reusing the line. On the 2nd of October, a work train was trapped in the tunnel when part of the roof collapsed onto the locomotive, rupturing the boiler and killing the driver. The story goes that when the rescue team came in to try and save those trapped in the mess, they saw an unearthly, blood-covered humanoid creature with jagged teeth and skin hanging from its body, hunched over one of the victims. It quickly fled the tunnel and was pursued by a group of men before it took refuge in Hollywood Cemetery, 2.2 miles away from the tunnel, hiding in a mausoleum bearing the name W.W. Poole, dated 1913. Some tellings of the story say that Poole was ran out of England for being a vampire, with the tomb they reside in having a Masonic and ancient Egyptian style, making people more convinced of the vampire theory. Supposedly, the tunneling awakened an ancient evil that lived under Church Hill, and that caused the cave-in as well as the appearance of the vampire. Because there's a university campus close to the cemetery, the story quickly became popular with students, and as a result still circulates today. As interesting as the story is, in reality the vampire wasn't some ancient evil disturbed by the workers, but most likely Benjamin F. Mosby, the fireman on the locomotive. When the tunnel collapsed onto the locomotive, it ruptured the boiler, resulting in Mosby, who was working without a shirt on due to the heat, getting his torso badly burnt with scalding steam and his teeth broken by flying debris. Witnesses said he was in shock and layers of his skin were hanging from his body. He died in hospital and was buried at the Hollywood Cemetery. The tunnel was sealed and hasn't been used since. A plan was devised in 2006 to dig up the buried locomotive, but was quickly shot down over concerns of the project causing more sinkholes. While the vampire part of the story has been disproven, the tale of Churchill Tunnel is still a very grisly one nonetheless. I feel if there is a moral to this tale, it's that some bad projects are salvageable, but some are best left alone, and to only live on as nothing more than a tall tale. If Bollywood has taught us anything, it's that India is a bizarre place. But don't let that fool you, because just like any other place, it's home to a few ghosts and scare stories of its own. Opened in 1960, the Beguncador railway station served the people of Beguncador, West Bengal, for around 7 years. The station was about as busy as you'd expect a 1960s Indian railway station to be, but just 8 years later, the station was pretty much abandoned, with no trains stopping there at all. According to local villagers in 1967, the station master said they spotted the ghost of a woman dressed in a white sari walking along the tracks. He believed it was the spirit of a woman that had been killed in a local railway accident years prior. When he told people about it the next day, they simply blew it off as him seeing things. It wasn't until a few days later that people started to become scared, when the bodies of the station master and his family were found dead in their quarters. The station was closed shortly after, as locals daren't set foot anywhere near it in case they fell victim to the clearly hostile spirit. The local government was adamant that there wasn't a ghost lingering around the station, but it obviously wasn't enough for some people. For years, the station was left abandoned, and it wasn't until 2007, after local villagers banded together and contacted the local government, did the station reopen. Even today, the death of the station master's family and the sighting of the ghost is still enough to deter some people. No trains stop at the station after sunset, with the exception of one for late-night workers. There are few to no full-time staff employed at the station, and the building is decorated with images of several Hindu gods to ward off any evil spirits. Some paranormal investigators confirm the presence of abnormal electromagnetic waves. Others claim to see the ghost as frequently as twice a week, but some claim to have seen nothing. Though given how people have died under mysterious circumstances, I think it's fair to say there's a good chance there's something paranormal afoot. Just don't go to the station alone if you're ever passing by. Built in 1848, the York Road railway station in Belfast served as a vital hub for travel and transport across Ireland. The station was bombed during an air raid in 1941, remodelled in 1975, and closed in 1992. Just another run-of-the-mill railway station. Oh, and how could I forget? It was also haunted for a while. York Road Station was an important hub for passengers while it was in service, and like most stations, It had a few shops and cafes for commuters to stop at and pick up food, drink and essentials for their travels. At night, however, while closing up the canteen, there's one person that didn't seem to want to leave, and as such, staff would simply leave them there while they cleaned and closed down. This was the ghost of a member of staff that was killed in the station in the 1970s during a robbery gone wrong. The worker was either shot or beaten during the robbery and ended up succumbing to their injuries. Years later, a figure was spotted in the canteen late at night by staff before it quickly vanished. It was also spotted in and around the running sheds of the station, and many members of staff claimed they could hear distant footsteps while the station was empty. Most people that encountered the ghost believed it to be the spirit of the dead staff member. After it was closed in 1992, the station was demolished, with only a nearby maintenance depot remaining that is still used by Northern Ireland Railways. It is unknown if the spirit is still in the area, but that raises the question: if you take the building away from the ghost that's haunting it, what are they to do? Hang around or finally move on? And if they do now have the option to move on, I wonder if this spirit has. Now, seeing ghosts appear after someone dies is common practice. Some spiritualist will probably end up explaining why in the comments, stuff to do with unfinished business and whatnot. But there's an old Canadian ghost story that challenges that, one where the ghosts decided to appear before anyone died. There are a few different perspectives of the story, but the tale is the same throughout most of them. It happened in May of 1908, 3 kilometers outside of Medicine Hat, Alberta. A man by the name of Gus Day worked as a fireman on the local railroad and was firing an engine pulling a train to Dunmore from Medicine Hat, with a man named Bob Toohey driving the engine. It was late at night on a single-track line. When they were around 3 kilometers outside of Medicine Hat, they saw a blazing light, similar to that of an engine's headlamp, coming down the line towards them. As it was a single track, Toohey and Day both thought they were about to crash into an oncoming engine, when suddenly the light sharply veered right and passed their train. The light itself was a train, seemingly floating past them on no rails. Ghostly enginemen and passengers in the carriage waved at Toohey and Day as they passed by. Once they completed the trip, Toohey was so frightened by the event he decided to move into yard work. One account of the story says that he went to a fortune teller shortly afterward, who told Toohey that he'd die soon, prompting him to take some time off work. Day continued to work as a fireman on the route, until one night 2 weeks after the initial sighting, he was firing a train being driven by a man named Jay Nicholson. In the same place, just outside of Medicine Hat, the ghost train appeared again, veering right just before collision and floating past Day's engine. Both Day and Nicholson were shook by the sighting, but carried on with their work. Over a month later, on the 8th of July 1908, Day was firing an engine in the yard when news came there had been a serious accident. 2 trains had collided head-on on a single-track line 3 kilometers outside of Medicine Hat, in the exact same spot Day had spotted the ghost trains. 7 people died in the accident, them being a few passengers, the fireman on the passenger train, and both of the engine drivers. The drivers were none other than Jay Nicholson and Bob Toohey, who had just gotten over his paranoia of the ghost train and taken up driving again. It's fair to say that Day likely never wanted to fire a freight engine or passenger train ever again. But it is a curious thought though. Can someone's ghost appear before they die? Who knows? Many stations in the UK, for one reason or another, seem to be haunted or the centre of goings-on for various paranormal peoples. Most spirits have been identified and often more than not tend to frighten staff and passengers alike. However, there's one station where its ghostly goings-on for most staff is just seen as part of the job. The Leamington Spa railway station is one of the more unusual of the ghost stories I've read, as there is no one specific ghost haunting the station. No notable deaths or fatal accidents have happened there, yet for whatever reason, paranormal activities have been going on in the station for several years now. Staff have reported everything from mysterious slamming doors, sounds of footsteps throughout the station when nobody else should be there, paperwork in the top office being thrown around, and lights switching on and off on their own. While not the most troublesome spirits to ever haunt a station, many people have claimed to feel their presence while in the building. The eeriest part of the station is a basement area on the third platform, which is home to a partially blocked off set of stairs that seem to go nowhere. After a while, a supernatural liaison was hired to confirm whether or not the station was actually haunted. After investigating the building, they confirmed there was something supernatural present. However, they described the ghosts as friendly with good energy. Nobody is quite sure who or what is hanging around the station, but most of the staff don't seem to mind having an otherworldly visitor on shift with them. When interviewed, a member of staff remarked, "I find it is often a quick and easy way to end a meeting, having a door slam for no logical reason. I've now learned to live in harmony with the ghosts." A nighttime security officer also added, "Leamington Spa station is one of the most haunted places I have been to, and I've been to many. Whoever the ghost is, they don't seem keen on going anywhere anytime soon. But given how they seem to get along with the railway staff, I think you'll agree that perhaps this once, it might not be so bad to have a ghost hanging around." In 1858, the Western North Carolina Railroad built a large stone bridge that crossed a creek in Boston. The bridge is around 60 feet tall and still stands today. It also happens to be home to a well-known urban legend. In 1891, a late-night passenger service crossed the bridge at around 3 a.m., with most of the passengers on board being asleep. As it crossed the bridge, the locomotive jumped the tracks and ended up plunging into the creek below, dragging several carriages down with it. 22 people were killed in the accident, either from the fall or by drowning in the creek trapped under the wreckage. The story goes that 50 years later, early in the morning of the 27th of August 1941, a woman was waiting by her car that was pulled over at the side of the road. The car had a flat tire and her husband had gone to find help. The bridge was close by and the woman heard a train whistle approaching. She looked over and saw an engine's lamp approaching, and as it crossed the bridge, the train plunged off and crashed into the creek. She ran to the wreck and saw the locomotive and several old wooden carriages piled into a jagged mound, with the sound of screams and moans of injured people coming from within the pile. She approached the wreck and described the mess as terrible, with the twisted mass of metal and wood now starting to be flooded by the creek. Hearing a car pull up on the road behind her, she ran back, screaming that a terrible wreck had happened. Both her husband and a man who owned a local store were in the car. Both rushed over to the bridge, only to find nothing was there. Both men simply thought the wife had passed out and dreamed the whole thing. It was early in the morning after all, but the woman was adamant about what she saw. After the couple fixed the tire and set off again, she made her husband stop at the next train station. She asked the station agent if there had been a wreck that night. The agent remarked, "Funny you should ask. There was no wreck at the railroad last night, but 50 years ago today, there was a horrible wreck at Boston's Bridge." The woman promptly fainted when she realized she'd seen a ghost train. Recently, on the 27th of August 2010, a group of 12 amateur ghost hunters gathered on the bridge in hopes of seeing the ghost train firsthand. At 2:45 a.m, a real train came down the line at the same time they thought they'd see a ghost train. The group believed it to be the ghost train and didn't flee, resulting in 2 of them getting injured and 1 of them dying. It's fair to say that it's not the most terrifying ghost story out there, but the bridge does still hold the eyes of many ghost hunters and paranormal investigators. I wonder if there's a chance anyone else will ever see the phantom train. The Clayton Tunnel of West Sussex is unique for 2 main reasons, the first being its appearance. The second thing that makes it unique isn't just the fact it's haunted, but rather the fact that it seems to be haunted by a few ghosts that don't really mind sharing their space with the living world. Measuring in at 1.3 miles in length, the tunnel was dug through a base of solid chalk, which took a total of 3 years to complete, opening in 1841. The northern tunnel entrance owes its unique castle look to the landowner who sold the area to the railway company, as he demanded that the tunnel entrance be distinctive and not just a black hole that leads into the side of a hill. As the tunnel was being dug, a small cottage was built on top of the tunnel entrance that served as a wage office. It eventually became a mess room for the gangers while on breaks, and after the tunnel was completed, it was converted into a home. One of the head gangers that worked on the tunnel brought his wife and children over to stay in the cottage. It was later taken over by another family. In 1861, 2 trains collided in the tunnel due to a signalling error. 23 people were killed in the accident as a train slammed into the back of a passenger train that had stopped in the tunnel. The rear coach was decimated and the locomotive that struck it was lifted up until its funnel scraped against the tunnel roof. Several of the bodies had to be kept in the basement of the cottage until they could be taken away and buried. The accident eventually resulted in a change to railway signalling rules. The accident also served as a basis for Charles Dickens's ghost story, The Signalman. Another non-fatal accident happened in the tunnel in 1926, and in 1973, 3 territorial army soldiers were killed in the tunnel while taking part in a map reading exercise. Ever since these accidents, families that lived in the cottage said they've heard the sounds of shrieks, screams, and metal crashing against metal echoing through the tunnel. A nearby field where the bodies of accident victims were kept is also said to be haunted. A former resident, Mrs. Muriel Atmere, who lived there for 38 years, said she loved the cottage as it was so peaceful and rural, despite the occasional rush of passing trains and the fact the place was haunted. One of the towers had a sealed-off entrance that led to an inspection tunnel for the ventilation shafts. Her family said they could frequently hear the sounds of footsteps and sighs coming from the inspection tunnel, and believed that it was the ghost of a ganger that died digging the tunnel. They could never see or identify who the ghost might be, and so they gave it the nickname of Charlie. The entrance was later doubly sealed, and Muriel would often think to herself, "Poor old Charlie, now he's stuck in there." While many have passed it off as simply wind blowing through the tunnel, Muriel contested that other spooky goings-on have happened in the cottage. She noted how she would sometimes hear a drumming noise coming from the table in the living room, as if someone was impatiently tapping their fingers on it. Muriel also spotted a faint glow coming from one of the towers on more than one occasion, saying it was in the shape of a man of medium height. Every time she saw the light, she would simply go back into the house. She said she was willing to investigate noises, but not the light. There was also a spirit she referred to as the White Lady. Muriel said she felt the presence of the spirit, but never saw it herself. 2 of her grandchildren did see the White Lady, and had to call Muriel into their bedroom one night to tell the ghost to leave. The garden, that contains a small orchard of apple, pear and plum trees, was also home to a sad atmosphere. It turned out that the bodies of men that died while building the tunnel were laid out in the orchard before they were sent away to be buried. Many who have lived in the house have said it's quiet and surprisingly peaceful, despite all the hauntings. Strange sounds can be heard at night, but most people put it down to animals from the nearby woods or just air blowing through the tunnel. Clayton Tunnel remains unique among haunted railway architecture, as it doubles as not only a haunted tunnel, but also a haunted house. It must be strange living most of your life alongside ghosts, but it seems for many residents, including Mrs. Atmere, that having a few spectral housemates wasn't much of a deal breaker. Perhaps this proves that a house being haunted might not always mean it's unwelcoming, and that instead, having a ghost hanging around might sometimes give a house those quirks that make it feel a little more like a home. Railway crossings are pretty dangerous things, if you're a bit dim. I mean, with gates, flashing lights and sirens, it's fairly obvious when you're not supposed to cross. Back in the old days though, most railway crossings were blocked by gates that, unless you were near a signal box, you had to manually step out of your car and open and close behind you. While the system worked, it did mean that you needed to be fast on your feet if you spotted a train thundering towards you. As you'd expect, there have been many accidents at level crossings, and it's happened that some of these accidents have been fatal. The Connington level crossing in Cambridgeshire has seen a few accidents in its time. It's a narrow crossing which makes it hard to see oncoming trains, so as you'd expect, there have been 1 or 2 fatal incidents. In the early 1940s, a truck carrying several German prisoners of war was passing over the crossing when it was struck by a train. A thick fog prevented both the engine and lorry drivers from seeing each other until it was too late. Later in 1948, a colonel was driving over the crossing and opening one of the gates when an express train came barreling towards him. He tried to get his dog out of the car before the collision, but it was too late, with both dying when the train impacted the car. It's said that both him and his dog were buried beside the line. Since the accident, many have reported hearing voices coming from around the crossing, sometimes yelling or crying out in pain. Other people have said they've seen a 1940s Chrysler drive over the crossing, only for it to disappear halfway. There have also been reports of a ghostly man and a dog appearing around the crossing area. People living close to the crossing had also reported the gates opening and closing by themselves, as if someone was crossing the tracks. The old gates were replaced with automatic electrical ones around the 1970s, and no new cases of the gates mysteriously opening have come forth ever since. The ghosts may just be an urban legend, but I think the story is still quite clear. Just look both ways and be careful at level crossings. I think for tonight's story, rather than read out the name of some train station and tell you who died there and that they've been seen haunting the place, I shall read a first-hand account of a driver working in the London Underground and how their first encounter with an underground ghost was a lot more underwhelming than they thought it would be. For some unknown reason, the ghost of a young woman seems to lurk around Elephant and Castle station in London. Rather typically, many have reported hearing strange footsteps around the station when it is empty, as well as spotting the spirit enter and walk along trains parked in the station, seemingly vanishing without getting off. Despite her supernatural nature, she just seems to be a part of the job for some people that works there, as one driver recalled, saying, "'Twas about 6 of the evening at a Bakerloo Line underground station, about a week ago. I was in pursuit of my duties as an employee of the London Underground, so I joined the train at the terminus at Elephant and Castle and walked forward to the front of the train with a view to travelling with the driver. At this point the driver has not arrived, so I put my bag down and moved to the rear door to wait for him. While I am waiting, a girl gets into the carriage. She walks straight through the carriage and I have to move aside, making some muttered apology. I sort of have to do this since I was in uniform. A minute or so later the driver turns up, and we move towards the front of the train. I notice that the girl is not in the carriage, and this is a rather immediate cause for concern. She could not have left the train without passing me. I had a full view of the carriage and platform at the time. My reaction was to inform the driver. The only place she could have gone was to have walked down the tunnel. Not really what we want. The driver's response was unusual. "Oh, her. We hear about her all the time. She's even been in the papers." Lovely. My first real ghost is a media celebrity, and it must be said, very, very boring indeed. Niagara Falls is a beautiful place to visit if you want to be in the one place in the world that's guaranteed to make you want to pee. If you wander around the area, you'll come across a section of railway line belonging to Canadian National Railways, and running under that railway is a small little tunnel that's home to a rather unhappy ghost. When the line was being built in the early 1800s by the Grand Trunk Railway, several tunnels needed to be built under raised sections of the track. These are to allow water to properly drain from one side of the embankment to the other, as well as let local farmers safely move supplies and livestock to the other side of the tracks without the need to pass over the busy rail line. A local legend tells that one of these tunnels is haunted by the ghost of a farmer's daughter. The story goes that the farmhouse caught fire one night and the girl fled while engulfed in flames. She ran until she collapsed in the nearby tunnel where she promptly burnt to death. Other tellings of the story say that the girl was set on fire by her father in a fit of anger during a messy divorce, while another says she was raped in the tunnel, killed, and her body was burned to hide the evidence. Whatever the story, if you stand in the middle of the tunnel and strike a match, the ghost of the girl will blow it out and begin to scream. Distant screams have also been heard by local residents and passers-by originating from the tunnel. This earned it the nickname of the Screaming Tunnel, and has since become a small area of interest for paranormal investigators. Despite the conflicting stories, the main thread of them all involving a girl being burned is enough to keep people coming to see if the rumours are true. Whatever the story, perhaps we should stop striking matches around the tunnel, and maybe just give the poor girl a break, eh? To any British rail enthusiast, the name Crewe is one with some significance. Home to one of the most important locomotive foundries, Crewe earned its place on the map for building everything from tank engines to goods locomotives and even the famous LMS Princess Coronation Express locomotives. Naturally, the surrounding area would become famous as well, but not for the same reasons. For whatever reason, there have been hundreds of ghost stories and sightings at Crewe's railway station, with some saying they've spotted a phantom cat that seems to appear and disappear as it pleases. Others have seen children's footsteps appear inexplicably, and many believe there are secret tunnels under the station that too are haunted. An old elevator shaft located in the station is the key part in the tunnel theory, as many believe that it was formerly a private lift built into the station that accessed secret tunnels built underneath the platforms to allow for the royal family to travel safely. The old shaft is now home to the most eerie part of the station, as a wailing howl can be heard coming from it.
We're not left there.
People have investigated the area thinking it was a lost animal, but found nothing. A former station master remarked that the whole place had a sense of dread about it, and that working there wasn't for the faint of heart. Virgin Trains eventually called in a paranormal investigator to ease the minds of staff. The investigator confirmed the presence of something supernatural in the building and frequently keeps check on the station. What exactly the supernatural entities are that are hanging around the station isn't quite known, but one thing is for certain: that wailing howl from the lift certainly doesn't make me want to find out. Not every ghost that haunts the rails was necessarily killed by a train. Some, like William Therese, died in some other way and ended up with their spirit stuck lingering around some railway. Some of these ghosts, however, didn't die easily, and the ghost of King's Cross is a bleak reminder. On the 18th of November 1987, a fire broke out in the tube station of King's Cross St Pancras in London. It's believed that either a lit match or a cigarette was dropped down the side of one of the wooden escalators, causing a fire to start underneath it. The fire couldn't be reached with an extinguisher, and the fire brigade was soon summoned. Because the fire was under the escalator, it took a while for the firemen to get to it. Around 3 minutes after the firefighters arrived, the police decided to evacuate the station, and 3 minutes later, by 7:42 PM, the entire escalator was on fire, producing superheated gas that built up against the ceiling. The paint was burnt away, uncovering many layers of old paint beneath it, which quickly went up in flames, producing thick, red-hot black smoke. The sudden ignition of the paint killed and injured several people still trapped underground, with many having to escape via train. It wasn't until 1:46 in the morning that the fire was finally put out. 31 people died in the fire and roughly 100 were injured. An inquiry was launched and many stations quickly had to replace their wooden escalators with modern metal ones. Many other overlooked safety regulations were rewritten and the underground trains were made significantly safer. Many years later, after the fire, in 1998, a lady was travelling through the station when she said she spotted another woman visibly distressed. The distressed woman was dressed in regular 80s clothes, but also screaming with her arms outstretched. The lady approached the distressed woman to see if she was okay, only for a passenger to walk straight through the woman as if she wasn't there. The ghost was also spotted by another gentleman, again seeing a normal-looking woman crying into her hands. As he approached the woman to try and comfort her, he simply passed through her before she disappeared. There are some who say they can still smell smoke in the station where the fire broke out despite it being years after the blaze. Whether it's only one ghost in King's Cross or all 31 of the victims still haunting the place is yet to be truly known. Let's hope that you're not stuck in the last moments of your life before you become a ghost, because being trapped in a station inferno for eternity doesn't sound pleasant to me. Not every ghost haunts the same. While some ghosts are content to just walk around, some like to be disruptive by banging doors, sending chills up your spine, or simply going boo. There are some ghosts, however, that take disruptive haunting to another level. It was a rainy night in 1867, just outside of Mesa, North Carolina. Conductor Joe Baldwin was riding in the caboose at the back of a goods train late one night headed towards Wilmington, keeping the time and sorting out paperwork. He suddenly noticed that the train seemed to be slowing down, only to find that the caboose had become uncoupled from the rest of the train and was slowly coming to a stop along the line. His biggest concern wasn't being stranded, but rather the passenger train that was scheduled to follow shortly behind his goods train. If it hit his caboose at full speed, there would likely be a fatal accident. Choosing to prevent the crash, Baldwin stood at the back of his caboose and waved his red light to warn the oncoming train. The driver spotted Baldwin, but it was too late for him to stop completely, causing him to collide with Baldwin's caboose. The driver had slowed the train down enough to minimize damage and save his passengers, but Baldwin died in the collision, having been decapitated in the wreck. His lantern was flung out of his hand and into the nearby swamp. The accident was quickly cleared and he was buried a few days later. Some accounts of the story say that his head was never found. After the accident, local residents said they spotted a white light appear along the section of track close to the collision. The light appeared frequently and rumours started to circulate that it was Joe Baldwin's ghost searching for his missing head. The light was later reported as appearing far in the distance and floating around 5 feet off the ground as it moved east along the tracks. Some sightings even spotted it approaching Meso Station before disappearing or moving back down the line. Some people and railroad workers have said they've spotted 2 lights along the track, with the lights being bright enough for some engine drivers to see them and stop their trains, thinking it was someone signalling them to stop. Eventually, the railroad started to use red and green lights to signal drivers as the ghost lights were disrupting so many services. Supposedly, while President Grover Cleveland's train was picking up fuel and water at Meso, the president spotted the odd signal lights and when he inquired about them, was told the story of Joe Baldwin. Some accounts of the story say that the president spotted the ghost himself. The ghost has been a frequent sight around Meso, with people stating they too have seen the infamous light. In 1964, a ghost hunter by the name of Hans Holzer was contacted to confirm whether the ghost was real. Holzer cited how frequently the ghost had been spotted and as such confirmed of its existence. In 1980, that segment of the railroad was no longer in use, and as such the rails were pulled up. Since then, sightings of the ghost have greatly diminished, with only a few people spotting the light here and there. Some have proposed a more logical explanation that gas being released by the nearby swamp was refracting lights from the nearby town and highway. While there have been experiments done that give this theory some merit, many first-hand witnesses to the ghost light noted how the light looked distinctly like that of a kerosene lamp, and not like other lights in the area. Maybe people were just seeing things going up and down the line. Maybe it's a hoax, maybe it's real. Whatever the case, if the ghost of Joe Baldwin is still out there, looking for his head, then I wish the best of luck to him, because he certainly needs it. The London Underground has been around for a long time and is one of the most important means of public transport throughout the City of London. It also seems to be one of the most haunted areas in London, sometimes through chance, but sometimes through tragedy. During the Second World War, many of London's underground stations were used as air raid shelters throughout the Blitz. They were deep underground, spacious enough to accommodate hundreds of people, and the tunnels could be used as emergency exits in the event the entrance was blocked off by rubble. On the 3rd of March 1943, 500 people were already taking shelter in Bethnal Green Station when at 9 PM the air raid sirens sounded. Authorities were directing local residents to the station to take cover. More than 1,500 people went to Bethnal Green to seek shelter. This wasn't a problem as the station had 5,000 bunks and was capable of sheltering up to 7,000 people if needed. What was an issue was the sudden influx of people and the rain. As everyone was making their way down the steps into the station, an anti-aircraft rocket was fired, making a distinct whistling sound. With sirens going off and planes overhead, people panicked thinking it was a dropping bomb and tried to rush into the station. The rain, however, made the stairs wet and slippery. All it took was one person to trip over. The person behind them was pushed into them, causing them to slip too. It was a domino effect of people falling down the stairs and piling on top of each other, but the pile kept on growing as people were pushed into the station by others outside trying to escape the danger. The growing weight of the mess crushed the people at the bottom of the pile to death, but the people outside weren't aware of the accident and kept pushing down into the station. More and more people ended up in the pile and, as a result, more and more people were crushed to death. A total of 173 people died, 27 men, 48 women, and 62 children. To quell the public backlash, the government said a bomb had gone off, resulting in the deaths of so many, rather than admitting the accident happened. It wasn't until 2013 a memorial was placed in the station marking the loss of those caught up in the crush. Years later, around 1981, a station master was finishing his duties late one night. The rest of the staff had gone home and he was doing his rounds, turning off lights and securing entrances and exits. He returned to his office to sign off some papers when he heard what sounded like children sobbing. He brushed it off as nothing, but the sound kept getting louder and louder. Then suddenly, female voices and screams joined those of the children's. The sound became louder and more frantic, lasting almost 15 minutes until the station master panicked and ran to the booking hallway to escape the noise. Many other staff working at the station have also reported hearing the dreadful sounds of women and children screaming for their lives echoing throughout the station on late, lonely nights. I think the message to take away from this is to always keep your cool, watch your step, and be careful when you're in a rush, because you certainly don't want to be at the bottom of the pile. Preston, Lancashire, is a fairly busy place. It's been around for a while and many people live there. In the middle of Preston, you can also find the Macquarie Tunnel, which is home to a lot of overgrowth, a few rats, and a well-known local legend. In 1836, the Preston and Longridge Railway Company was set up to build a line from a nearby quarry to Preston. The line required the construction of 3 tunnels, totaling 788 metres in length. The only things separating the tunnel are some gaps for ventilation. The railway was frequently used for transporting freight and quarry stone, but was also known to carry passengers from 1856 onwards. In 1866, a 15-year-old girl by the name of Margaret Banks fell from a train carriage while passing through a station and was dragged to her death by the train. The railway stopped running passenger trains in the 1930s as buses became the preferred method of transport for the locals. The line was still used for freight and goods until it was finally closed in 1980. Local legend says that you can sometimes hear the screams of the girl who was dragged to her death echoing through the tunnels. Many have said they've spotted the ghost of a woman in and around the tunnel entrances who has come to be known as the Grey Lady. Supposedly, she beckons and welcomes people into the tunnel, but has never been reported as malicious. Those who have entered the tunnel remarked about the feelings of unease they have experienced and that it has a strange energy. I found a blog post written by a Joseph Stashko in 2010 recounting the time he and a friend investigated the tunnel. Stashko said he wasn't a big believer in the supernatural, but went on to say that his friend managed to capture a blue light moving through the tunnel on camera. After investigating the area, they found no crack, hole, or opening for the light to have come from, so it's very possible they saw the Grey Lady herself. In recent times, plans have been going round to relay the old railway line and tunnel as part of a new tramway. What this means for the Grey Lady though, I'm not sure. Maybe she'll enjoy having some more visitors pass through. In the meantime, if any of you decide to try and see this local legend for yourself, don't forget to say hello for me. The only thing more annoying than missing your train is waiting to catch a train on an empty platform, only to turn around and find you're surrounded by ghosts. If, however, you decide to catch a late-night train from New Street Station in Birmingham, you might end up in such an unfortunate situation. When the original station was being built in 1848, a Jewish cemetery needed to be dug up in order to make space for the station's foundations. If anyone listening understands the basics of the spirit world, shunting around corpses and messing in graveyards is not a very good idea. Because of this, many believe that the entire station building is cursed. The area has an air of unease about it, with the most chilling place being Platform 4. Throughout the years, 4 people have committed suicide in the station building, specifically on Platform 4. The first was a gentleman by the name of Claude, who poisoned himself around the Victorian period for unknown reasons. One of the most well-documented deaths took place around the late 1940s, involving a former engine driver by the name of Walter Hartles, who, at the age of 68, shot himself in the chest in the waiting room after going through some messy marital issues. Along with those who have taken their own lives, a fatal collision happened in the station in 1921, killing 3 people. While most would simply call it a tragic accident, there are some more spiritual people who may believe it was the angry and disturbed spirits from the old graveyard getting a little payback. During the 60s, the station was rebuilt to look more modern, but after being branded as an eyesore in the early 2000s, it was rebuilt again to look more modern. Despite these changes, the ghosts of both Claude and Walter have still been seen around the station after dark, both wearing clothes that fit the era. Many people walking past the waiting room often say they see an old man sitting alone before he fades away. A séance was planned a few years ago in order to contact the spirits, but was cancelled over safety concerns. It's fair to say that not many people fully believe in curses and cursed buildings, but given its history and what it's built on, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that New Street Station may well be cursed. Let's just hope none of the staff decide to reenact The Shining anytime soon. Nottinghamshire is famous for being the place where Robin Hood would poach deer and dodge taxes. And just like every old famous place in the UK, it's also home to a few ghosts. From Wallerton Hall, Trent Bridge and the National Justice Museum. But of course, the ones we're interested in today are those that hang around Rolleston Station. On the 5th of December 1874, John Bradwell, a senior church warden, was walking along the rail foot crossing to the other side of the station. Him being almost deaf meant he didn't hear an oncoming train, which knocked him down. He was taken to Newark Station where a surgeon was waiting to treat him, but Bradwell died of his injuries by the time he had arrived. Many years later, an accident took place on the station's level crossing involving a train colliding with a lorry. The driver of the lorry was killed in the collision. Ever since, station masters, staff and local residents have reported seeing several ghosts appearing in and around the station. The first is the ghost of the lorry driver, standing in the place where the accident happened. The other ghost that has been spotted is the phantom of a smartly dressed man carrying a newspaper. The ghost is said to appear on the platform and disappear just as quickly. It is also reported that a ghost train passes through the station from time to time. A crossing keeper was on duty when they heard the sound of a steam locomotive approaching. He could hear it slow down and stop at the station, even smelling the coal and steam. Yet, looking around, he couldn't see a train anywhere. The spirits' presence don't seem malicious, and as such, folks just don't mind them if they see them. We at least have an explanation for why the lorry driver and the ghost train may appear from time to time. However, the gentleman with the newspaper still remains a mystery. For all our sakes though, let's just hope he doesn't look like this. And now, not the story of a ghost train, but of a ghost tunnel. Hoosac in Native American roughly translates to pile of rocks. However, many have mistranslated it over the years as meaning forbidden thanks to the Hoosac Tunnel. Seemingly two very different things, a pile of rocks and being forbidden, but it's fair to say people started calling it the Forbidden Tunnel for a bloody good reason. Construction of the tunnel began in 1851 and started fairly slow. The rock was very hard and unyielding, so much progress wasn't made until the introduction of nitroglycerin into mining, with the Hoosac Tunnel being the first in the country to use nitroglycerin in its construction. Things were going fine until the 20th of March 1865, when three explosive experts named Ned Brinkman, Billy Nash and Ringo Kelly used nitroglycerin to progress their section of tunnel. As they set the nitro and ran back to the safety bunker, Ringo made it to the bunker first, and rather than wait for the others, he set off the charges early, burying Brinkman and Nash alive under the falling rock. After the accident, Ringo vanished without a trace, leading many to think it was an intentional act of murder. Whether it was just an accident or not is still unknown. Some accounts of the story says it was 10 days later when Ringo showed up again. Others say it was a year later. Either way, he was eventually found, with workmen discovering his corpse 2 miles deep into the tunnel where Brinkman and Nash had died. Ringo had been strangled to death, and the police deduced that he had died around 3:30 in the morning. No suspects were ever found and the crime remains unsolved. Rumours started to circulate among the construction crew that the vengeful spirits of Brinkman and Nash had lured Ringo back into the tunnel to kill him. As such, some men started to believe that the tunnel was cursed and left the digging site, with other men flat out refusing to enter, especially after dark. In 1868, an engineer and respected officer during the Civil War named Paul Travers received a letter from Mr. Dunn, the man in charge of the tunnel project, in the hopes that Travers would investigate it after workmen started to complain of hearing a man's voice cry out in agony. Progress had slowed down because of this. Dunn was convinced that it was just the wind, but the men wouldn't listen, so he hoped a visit from Travers would put them right. Travers and Dunn entered the tunnel at 9 PM on the 8th of September. Travers wrote a letter to his sister afterwards recalling the event of that evening. Dunn and I entered the tunnel at exactly 9 PM. We travelled about 2 miles into the shaft when we stopped to listen. As we stood there in the cold silence, we both heard what truly sounded like a man groaning out in pain. As you know, I have heard this same sound many times during the war, yet when we turned up the wicks on our lamps, there were no other human beings in the shaft except Mr. Dunn and myself. I'll admit, I haven't been this frightened since Shallow. Mr. Dunn agreed that it wasn't the wind we heard. Perhaps Nash and Brinkman? I wonder. Work continued until a month later when the worst accident in its construction took place. A gas explosion blew up the water pumping station on the surface, which killed 13 miners after the debris filled the tunnel they were working in. A miner was lowered into the shaft in an attempt to find any survivors, but was brought back to the surface a few minutes later, barely conscious from the fumes, only able to gasp, "No hope," to the rescue team. As the shaft started to fill with water, some of the bodies floated to the surface. The last body wasn't found until over a year later. During the year the bodies were still missing, local villagers told tales of vague shapes and muffled wails coming from the water-filled pit. Workmen claimed to see the lost miners carrying picks and shovels through the mist and snow of the mountaintop. The ghosts would appear and vanish, leaving no footprints in the snow and not answering to calls. Strangely, after the last body was found and properly buried, the apparitions stopped appearing, although the eerie moans coming from the tunnel continued to keep workmen terrified. A man by the name of Dr. Clifford J. Owens visited the tunnel on the 25th of June 1872, accompanied by James R. McKinstry, a drilling superintendent. It's not known exactly why the two visited the tunnel, but it was likely a shared interest in the ghost stories surrounding it. As they both reached 2 miles deep into the tunnel, they stopped to rest. The only lights in the tunnel were their dimmed lanterns. Dr. Owens described the place as being as cold and as dark as a tomb. As they were talking and resting, they heard a strange and mournful sound that Dr. Owens described as sounding like someone in great pain. He then said, "The next thing I saw was a dim light coming along the tunnel in a westerly direction. At first I believed it was probably a workman with a lantern, yet as the light grew closer, it took on a strange blue color and appeared to change in shape into the form of a human being with no head. The light supposedly got close enough for them to touch it, staying motionless for a moment as if it was watching them before it continued toward the east end of the tunnel, eventually vanishing." Dr. Owens later stated that he was, above all, a realist, and that he was not prone to repeating wild tales and gossip that defied reasonable explanation, but he admitted he was unable to deny what he and McKinstry saw that night. In 1874, close to the tunnel's completion, a local hunter named Frank Webster vanished near the mountain. 3 days later, he was found by a search party, in a state of shock, mumbling incoherently and stumbling along the banks of the Deerfield River. When he came to his senses, he explained that strange voices had ordered him into the Hoosac tunnel, and that once inside, he saw ghostly figures wandering around. He then said that invisible hands had snatched his hunting rifle and beat him with it. He was found with injuries matching that of a beating. Webster said he didn't remember leaving the tunnel. Later the same year, both tunnel headings were completed, and by the 9th of February 1875, the first train went through the tunnel. The news called the tunnel the Western Gateway to the rest of New England, but eerie things still went on. In the fall of that year, a fire tender was taking a wagon load of wood into the tunnel when he suddenly turned his team and horses around and rushed them out. The team and wagons were later found in the forest, but the fire tender was nowhere to be seen. For years, stories of ghosts and mysterious goings-on surrounded the tunnel, although the ghosts weren't always malicious. An employee of the railroad named Joseph Impoko frequently worked around the tunnel and was moving ice away from the tracks one day when a voice called to him, "Run, Joe, run!" He turned to see an engine rapidly approaching him, just managing to jump out of the way. When he tried to see who shouted his name, he saw nobody, and noted that the engine was too loud and too far away for it to have been the driver calling to him. 6 weeks after the incident, he was using a crowbar to free some freight cars that were frozen to the tracks, when the same voice frantically called out, "Joe, Joe, drop it, Joe!" He immediately let go of his crowbar as it was suddenly thrown against the wall of the tunnel. It turned out a power line had overheated and shorted out, causing more than 11,000 volts to be sent through the rails. Joe soon left his job and took up work outside of the area, but visited the tunnel every year as an homage to the ghost that had saved his life. He was certain that if he didn't do it, some tragedy would befall him. In 1977, his wife fell ill, and so he decided to stay at home with her instead of visiting the tunnel as he usually would do. His wife died in October of that year, and he believed she died because he had failed to visit the tunnel. In 1976, a paranormal researcher visited the tunnel and claims to have come face to face with a figure of a man in old-fashioned working clothes, backlit by a brilliant white light. In 1984, another researcher entered the tunnel with a railroad official, saying she felt the uncomfortable sensation of someone standing close to her the whole time. Another group of students left a tape recorder in the tunnel overnight, and when reviewing the recordings, said they heard what seemed to be muffled human voices. Strange sights and eerie feelings still surround the tunnel to this day. Despite this, it is still heavily used by the Boston and Maine Railroad. Overall, over 200 men died digging the 4.7-mile tunnel, which took 25 years to complete. The tunnel earned the nickname of the Blood Pit, and still to this day remains as one of the most haunted places in the US. So even though its name only means pile of rocks, I feel like Forbidden is a lot better fitting, mostly because the tunnel has certainly earned that name. Subscribe for more.